Hi everyone, this is Mr. Trio, and today we are talking about tackling paper number 2. As a reminder, paper number 2 has a few different components. Perhaps the thing that distinguishes it from other parts of the IGCSE curriculum is that it is a source-based analysis in which students are given different sources in which they have to look at during the paper and try to make sense of them. It is a 50-mark paper, and it comprises 33% of your overall grade. It is a 2-hour exam, so essentially the same as paper number 1. It comprises of 6 different questions. One of the big differences between paper 1 and paper 2, however, is that in paper 1 you get to choose which questions you wish to answer, so you can really answer questions that go to your own strengths. With paper number 2, the 6 questions are set in stone and you don't really have a choice. You have to answer the 6 questions which are given. Finally, the topic for paper number 2 is always chosen in advance. So you have to look at the syllabus, look at when you're taking the public exam in order to match up which subject area that you need to prepare for. For example, in June of 2018, the focus of paper number 2 will be why did international peace collapse in the 1930s, which is chapter 3 of the textbook. So please be mindful of what question is being asked for the year in which you are taking the paper. Now, one of the arguments that I'm going to make during this presentation today is that more than any other part of the IGCSE program, this paper requires a strong strategy. And today, I'm not going to be really focusing on the history of one particular topic over another, but what I want to do is really talk about what is the best strategy that you can take in order to be effective on paper number 2. And this strategy is essentially broken into 3 different parts. The first is looking at the background information which is provided in the paper, and we'll go into some samples a little later. The second is documenting your source analysis during the paper process. And then finally, understanding what are the types of questions that are going to be asked during paper number 2. So let's get started with A, looking at background information. Every paper number 2 begins with a short background information section. This is a paragraph that will introduce the topic. Usually, paper number 2 is about a specific event within the chapter which is determined ahead of time. One of the things that I would strongly recommend is once you open the paper, go immediately to the background information section and use your highlighter in order to essentially identify the key ideas. The background information will help you get up to speed with what the topic will entail. And there are several points that I would like to bring out. The first is, although it may be self-evident, is that the information which is in the background is true information. So use it. So even if you are a little weak in this particular area or there's a topic that you don't know a lot about, think of this background information as free information that you can use. And because the Cambridge group is essentially providing this background information, assume that the information is true. They're not going to give you background information which is wrong, in other words. So use that information as you think about the questions that are being asked. Second, use things like the names and the dates and events described in the background information in order to fill out the answers to the questions. Check your spelling. For example, let's say the topic is on Czechoslovakia. That's a hard word to spell, but in the background information, you'll have the correct spelling given to you. So throughout your answers, you can always use those difficult names, dates, and places in order to verify the information. And then finally, the background information is going to tell you what the focus of the sources is. So if you go into the sources with no point of view, then it may lead you in a path that the paper isn't really supposed to take you in. The background information will help focus where you need to put your attention. Now, the second part is the source analysis, and this is the thing that really, of course, makes paper number 2 different than the other components of the program. As a reminder, sources can be things such as quotes, letters, newspaper articles, official reports, political cartoons, and they can also come from present-day sources, secondary sources like biographies or history textbooks. I think it's very important to think about the breadth of different types of sources that could appear in these papers, because often in the question section, and we'll talk about this later, you need to compare sources. So how is a quote from the time period different than a passage from a textbook which is written recently? Now, one of the things that I would strongly recommend is when you receive your packet and it has the different sources, look at each of the sources and write down big ideas that are associated with the different sources. For example, if you had a political cartoon such as this one here, you could read into what the source is trying to tell you and put down these basic ideas in order to later go back to them when you start answering the questions. When you document things, I would recommend 3 main areas. Number 1, what is the purpose or the message that the source is trying to tell you? Second, are there any limitations that this source might have? And finally, does the source have a bias? All the sources are true to whatever the topic is, but it doesn't mean that all the sources are telling the truth. One of the things which you need to really work on over the course of the 2-year program is looking specifically at how symbolism is an important part of the source analysis. For example, if we look at this one here, many of you may be familiar with the fact that this gentleman here on the right-hand side is Uncle Sam. And he is an individual who represents the United States. When you see Uncle Sam in a political cartoon, automatically think this cartoon is about the United States. There are other symbolic things about a cartoon like this, such as the keystone, which is on the right-hand side, and how it is placed into the center of this bridge, meaning that the United States is not a part of this bridge. And then many political cartoons also have text, such as this League of Nations bridge was designed by the President of the United States. However, as you can see, the cartoon is showing the United States on the side, not part of the bridge. All of these things have to be thought about before you start answering the questions. If you do a full analysis beforehand, then you'll be able to approach the questions in a much more effective way. So before you even get to the questions, one of the things that may be helpful is to have a list of all the sources which are a part of paper number 2. And if you have them on a piece of scrap paper which is on the side, you can always look at that as you start to approach the questions. And especially if you are talking about comparing source A to source C or something along those lines, you can actually place the sources side by side in order to have a better understanding of that analysis. One of the first things that you want to do is look at all the questions first. And one of the reasons why this is important is that questions don't just stand on their own. They're interrelated to one another. So if you read all the questions first, it might give you an insight about things that might come along a little later. And of course, information in the questions may actually help stimulate how to respond to questions that are before or afterwards. Questions can be broken down into 3 different categories. 1, basic questions, in which you're being asked to describe something. Questions which are asking you to compare 2 sources against each other. And then the final question often asks you to consider all the sources together. So let's take each one of these and take a look at how to approach different questions for paper number 2. With a describe question, essentially what you want to start with is a strong topic sentence, which is the main theme or the purpose of the source. And we did this analysis already. We already know that this political cartoon is about the criticism of the United States not joining the League of Nations. And then, as you are describing what is happening, use the source itself. It shows Uncle Sam, a symbol of the U.S., sitting beside the bridge that represents the League. It shows the European nations as a part of the bridge. And it also states that the U.S. created the idea. So with a basic description question, you are talking about what the main purpose of the source is, and then you are directly going into the source in order to provide the evidence to support that idea. The second most common type of question is one that will ask you to compare 2 sources. Now, in this particular case, what you need to do is essentially, once again, start with a strong topic sentence which sets up what are the similarities and then the differences of these 2 sources. Your first paragraph would then be about similarities. Your second paragraph would be about differences. And then you would have a conclusion that would sum up all your findings. This is a typical compare question that you would find. What do sources A and sources B have in similar or differences? Finally, the most complex of the questions that are asked are the ones that ask you to consider or study all the sources. And for paper number 2, there is 8 sources that are provided. So this is a lot of heavy lifting. You have to consider a lot of different sources and a lot of different points of view. But one of the things that's very helpful is the question itself. The question will say, how far do these sources provide? And then it will give you a focus of what that is that you're supposed to essentially hone in on. So as a sample, here's a question. How far do these sources provide evidence that Wilson's idealism was the reason the League of Nations was a failure? Now, even if you don't know anything about this topic or Wilson, the thing that the question tips off to you is that this is your target, idealism. You know in advance that all of these sources, to some degree or another, are going to be talking about this idea of Wilson's point of view and how it's connected to the League of Nations and its eventual failure. What I would recommend is, once again, go to your sources, which are on those scrap pieces of paper, and start to organize them before you start to write. So you have sources A, C, E, and G on one side, and sources B, D, H, and F. And then you can say, well, these sources support the idea, and these are actually ones that go against that idea. By organizing the information in advance, you then start writing your essay with clear ideas already in mind. It's going to help you in the long run, so good organization up front will help you when you actually start writing. So that's the strategy that I have for you as you approach paper number 2. Start with the background information. This will help you focus in on what the topic is. Do your source analysis. Look at all the sources in advance before you start answering the questions. in order to understand the scope of what you are facing. And then finally, look at the questions. Is this a description question? Is this a comparison question? Or is this the question which is asking you to consider all the sources? I hope this strategy is helpful to you. And of course, we'll be practicing more in class about previous past papers and how the questions are framed in order to have some hands-on experience in this source analysis. Thanks for joining me, and we'll talk later.